She said it the way people say things when they've never had to ask twice for anything in their lives. Fix the clock. If you can actually do it, I'll consider letting you stay on the property. I remember standing in the front hallway of her house being the kind of word that doesn't really cover it, the way calling the Pacific Ocean a pond doesn't quite cover it, and thinking. I drove 4 hours from Sudbury for this. I left my daughter with my neighbor Bev, told her I'd be back by Sunday, and drove 4 hours in a truck that I was pretty sure was going to leave me on the 400 somewhere past Barrie. For this. The woman looking at me was named Constance Hale. She was maybe 65, silver hair pulled back tight, standing very straight the way some people do when they've decided a long time ago that the world should come to them. Behind her, through a set of open French doors, I could see a sunroom that was probably bigger than my entire apartment back home. A grand piano sat in the corner of it that no one had touched in what looked like years. And in the center of the main hall, on a mahogany table, was the clock. I'd heard about it from a guy named Pete Okafor, who did furniture restoration out of his garage in Chelmsford. He'd gotten a call from a solicitor's office about a Herschede grandfather clock, circa 1923, 9-tube Westminster chime movement, not running. He couldn't take the job. He gave them my name. I don't know why. We weren't close. Maybe he thought it would be funny. The clock was magnificent. Even stopped, even dusty, even standing in a house full of things competing for your attention, it was the kind of thing you felt before you fully saw it. 8 feet tall, quarter-sawn oak case with hand-carved columns. The dial was painted enamel, cream-going ivory, with blue Roman numerals and a moon phase window across the top that showed a painted sky I'd never seen turn. Whoever made this clock made it like they intended it to outlast everything else in the room, maybe everything else in the house. I crouched down to look at the base. My knees cracked. Constance Hale said nothing about that, but I felt her notice it. "When did it stop?" I asked. 12 years ago, she said. "My husband wounded last. After he died, no one touched it." I nodded and didn't say anything for a moment. In my experience, when someone tells you a broken thing was last touched by a person who is gone, you let that sit for a second before you start talking about gears. Her name was Constance, and she had inherited the property, a limestone estate on the eastern edge of Georgian Bay, from her late husband, a man named Frederick Hale, who had apparently made a significant amount of money in commercial real estate in Toronto before deciding in his 50s that he wanted to spend the rest of his life looking at the water. He'd bought the property, restored the main house, and filled it with things he loved. The clock was one of them. Constance had a daughter. Her name was June. She was 38, lived in Vancouver, flew in twice a year, and had, according to what I'd pieced together over the following weeks, never quite gotten along with her mother in the specific way that adult daughters sometimes don't get along with the mothers who raised them in houses like this one. Not hatred, not coldness, just a very long, very quiet disagreement about what life was supposed to look like. I didn't know any of this on that first day. On that first day, I just knew the clock, and I knew that whatever Constance Hale thought of me, she had called someone to fix it, which meant part of her still wanted it to run. I told her I'd need to open the movement, assess the damage, possibly source some parts. Herschede movements weren't impossible to find, but they weren't hanging on hooks at Canadian Tire either. She said, "How long?" I said, "Depends what I find inside." She looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding something, like she was running some kind of calculation I wasn't aware of. "There's a room above the garage," she said. "You can use it. I'll have Miriam bring towels." That was it. No negotiation, no asking what I charged, no, make yourself comfortable. Just the room above the garage and a woman named Miriam who appeared 20 minutes later with a stack of white towels and the polite non-expression of someone who had worked for Constance Hale long enough to have opinions she'd decided never to voice. "My name is Owen Lachlan. I'm 42. I restore antique clocks and mechanical instruments, watches, music boxes, barometers, the occasional automaton, if someone is willing to pay what that actually costs. I learned from my grandfather in his shop in New Liskeard, then from a man in Zurich who taught me that a movement is a conversation between its maker and anyone patient enough to listen. I've been doing this for 17 years. I'm good at it in the way that people who do one thing for 17 years and never stop learning tend to be good at things. I'm also, for context, a single father. My daughter's name is Maggie. She's 9. She has her mother's eyebrows and my stubbornness and an opinion about everything that she has never once kept to herself. Her mother left when Maggie was 3, not dramatically, not because of anything terrible, just because she decided, I think, that the life we had wasn't the life she'd wanted, and she was honest enough to say so rather than stay unhappy. We're on decent terms. Maggie spends Christmas with her in Halifax. The rest of the year it's me. I told Maggie I was going to fix a clock at a big house near the water. She said, "How big?" I said, "Pretty big." She said, "Bigger than our building?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Is it haunted?" I said, "I hope not." She said, "If it is, take pictures." I thought about that a lot, actually, over the following days, as I began working on the clock, because there was something in that house that felt like that. Not haunted, but occupied. Full of a presence that had left and hadn't quite managed to go. The Herschede movement was a 9-tubular bell chime, which meant when it worked it didn't just tick, it rang. Low, warm tones, the kind that don't echo so much as settle. Frederick Hale had chosen well. The problem, once I got the back panel open and the weights unhooked and the movement carefully disassembled on the work table I'd set up in the garage, the problem was a worn click spring on the strike train, a bent gathering pallet, and a pivot hole in the front plate that had worn oval over a century of use. Repairable. All of it repairable. But not fast. I fell into the work the way I always do, which is to say completely. Constance would appear occasionally in the doorway of the garage with what I eventually understood was her version of checking in. She'd stand there, say nothing, watch me work for 30 seconds or a minute, and then leave. The first few times I thought she was going to say something. By the 4th or 5th time I realized this was just what she did. She watched, she assessed, she kept her conclusions to herself. On the 5th day, June arrived. I heard a car on the gravel and looked up from the front plate I was polishing. A woman in a dark blue rain jacket was pulling a rolling suitcase toward the front door. And I don't know what I expected. I think I'd built up some idea of another version of Constance, just younger. But she wasn't that. She was tall. She had her father's coloring, I'd learn later, looking at the photographs in the hall. Dark hair going gray at the temples in a way she'd clearly decided not to fight. She moved like someone who'd stopped worrying about whether people were watching. She saw me. She raised her hand in a small wave. I raised mine back. That was the whole of it, that first exchange. Dinner that evening was not some things I was expecting to be included in. But Miriam appeared at the garage door at 6:30 and said that Constance would like me to join them. I washed my hands 3 times and still had metal dust under my fingernails, and I sat down at a table set with linen napkins and a wine I couldn't have named and felt approximately like what I was. A man from Sudbury who fixed clocks and wasn't sure which fork was for salad. Constance asked me about the movement. I told her what I'd found, what I'd ordered, how long the bushings would take to arrive from a supplier in Hamilton. She listened precisely, the way people listen when they actually understand what you're saying. I hadn't expected that. June said, "Dad used to wind it every Sunday evening, 7 o'clock before the news." Constance said nothing. June said he'd let me pull the weights up when I was small. I thought I was the most important person in the world. I said, "That's a good way to feel." She looked at me. "It is." Something shifted in the room after that. I couldn't have told you what. Just the temperature of it, maybe. Over the following days, June began coming to the garage. Not constantly. Not in any way that announced itself. She'd appear with 2 coffees from the kitchen, set one beside me, and ask what I was working on. I'd show her. She'd ask questions. Real questions, not polite questions, the kind that meant she was actually listening to the answers. She'd left a career in environmental law in Vancouver. She told me one afternoon, taken a leave of absence. Her mother's health had been not bad, not in any dramatic sense, but there'd been a fall last winter, a bad one. And June had started to understand that the particular way she and Constance didn't quite connect was a problem that had an expiration date, whether they handled it or not. "She doesn't know how to need people," June said. "She never learned. My daughter's 9, I said. She has no trouble with that." June smiled. The first full one I'd seen from her. "What's her name?" "Maggie." "What's she like?" "Honest to a fault. Obsessed with anything that has a mechanical explanation. She took apart my kitchen timer last month to see how it worked. She mostly put it back together." June laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that catches people off guard, including the person doing it. I want to be clear about something. I was not thinking about any of this in any particular way. I was thinking about the clock. I was thinking about whether the replacement click spring from Hamilton would be the right gauge or whether I'd have to modify it. I was thinking about Maggie and whether Bev remembered she couldn't have orange juice in the morning because of the medication she was still finishing from the ear infection in March. I was not thinking about June Hale or her laugh or the way she tucked her sleeves up when she was listening to something she found. I was not thinking about any of that. The bushings arrived on a Thursday. On Friday I fit them. On Saturday afternoon I reassembled the movement, reinstalled it in the case, hung the weights, and set the pendulum swinging. The clock ticked, slowly at first, the way old things sometimes need a moment to remember what they're for, and then steady, clean. The deep, patient rhythm of a thing made to last. I set the time and waited. At the quarter hour the chimes rang out through the hallway. 9 tubes, one after another, the Westminster sequence, warm and low and settling. Not an echo. A presence. Like something breathing again after a long time of not. Constance was standing in the doorway to the sunroom. I hadn't heard her come in. She was very still, and I looked at her face because I couldn't help it, and what I saw there was not what I expected. I expected relief, maybe. Satisfaction. What I saw was something that looked more like grief. The kind that waits in things we've put away and comes back when those things are opened. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "That's right. That's exactly right." She walked to the clock and put her hand against the case. Not the glass, not the dial, just the side of the oak, and stood there for a moment. I turned and went back to the garage to pack up my tools. June found me there an hour later. She said, "She's been sitting in the hall since you left. I've never seen her do that." I said, "The house sounds different now. She's probably adjusting." June said, "Owen." I looked up. She said, "She cried. I haven't seen my mother cry since my father's funeral. She sat in the chair beside the clock and she cried." I didn't know what to say to that. I went back to wrapping the last of my gauges. June said, "There's something I want to show you. Can you come inside?" We went up the main staircase, down a hallway I hadn't been in, past photographs, Frederick and Constance, younger versions, a beach somewhere, a girl who was clearly June at 5 or 6. At the end of the hall was a door. June opened it. It was a study. Small, packed floor to ceiling with books and binders and things that looked like they hadn't been touched in a while. At the center was a roll-top desk, closed, and on top of the desk, still in the position it must have been left in, was an envelope, old, but not ancient. The paper had gone a little soft, but the seal on the back was still intact. Not wax, just a standard envelope, sealed and never opened, written on the front in neat, careful handwriting. "For the person who gets the clock running again," I said. "That's been there since he died," June said. 12 years. No one opened it because the clock was never fixed. I said, "I can't open that." She said, "He didn't write your name on it. He wrote what you did." She looked at me. "That's you." I stood there for a long time. Long enough that June didn't rush me. Long enough to think about what it means when someone leaves a message in a bottle they don't know when or whether anyone will find. I picked up the envelope. The letter inside was 3 pages, handwritten, Frederick Hale's careful script filling every line. I won't tell you all of it. Some of it was for Constance. Some of it was for June. But part of it, the part I've read more times now than I can count, was for whoever was standing in that room. He wrote about the clock, how he'd found it at an estate sale in Orangeville in 1987, broken already, and had it restored by an old man in Guelph who'd charged him $400 and 2 bottles of scotch. How he'd stood in this house, this hallway, and heard it chime for the first time and thought, "This is the sound of being home." He wrote that he'd always believed that the people willing to fix things really fix them, not replace them, not discard them when they got complicated. Those were the people worth knowing, worth trusting. He wrote that if the clock had stopped and someone had taken the time and the care to make it run again, then whoever that person was, they already understood something about the world that a lot of people never learn. Then he wrote something that I've thought about almost every day since. He wrote, "There are things in this house I am leaving in poor condition. Not the objects, the people. If you're reading this, you've already shown you know how to be patient with something that has stopped running. I am asking you to extend that same patience to the women in this family. They are worth it, both of them, even when they make it difficult, especially then. I folded the letter. June was watching me from the doorway. I said, he knew the clock wasn't going to be fixed quickly. She said, he knew my mother wouldn't let anyone touch it unless she trusted them, and he knew that would take a while. I said, he was planning for someone he'd never meet. She said, he was a very far-thinking man. We went back downstairs. I found Constance in the hall, still in the chair beside the clock, which was still ticking. I sat down across from her, which I don't think anyone had done recently, because she looked slightly startled. I put the letter on the side table between us. She looked at it for a long moment without picking it up. She said, "You read it." I said, "He addressed it to me, in a manner of speaking." She looked at the clock. She said, "He would do something like this. He always thought ahead." It was infuriating. But she didn't sound infuriated. She sounded like someone trying very hard to keep the right word for a feeling she hadn't used in a while. She picked up the letter. She read it slowly, and all 3 pages, and I sat there and let her, and the clock kept time. When she finished, she set it down and said, "My daughter." I said, "Yes." She said, "She's been here a week, and I've said nothing worth saying to her." I said, "She knows that. She's still here." Constance looked at me, something in her face that I don't have a precise word for. It wasn't softening exactly, because I don't think Constance Hale softened. It was more like a decision being made. A long, delayed one. She said, "You have a daughter." I said, "Maggie. She's 9. She said, "Does she know what you do?" I said, "She knows I fix things." Constance was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That's not a small thing to know about your father." I drove home on Sunday morning, the 4 hours back north through the Shield, the granite and the spruce, and the lakes, sitting still in the October cold. I stopped at a Tim Hortons outside Huntsville and called Bev, and she said Maggie was fine, had eaten good, had asked 17 questions about grandfather clocks that morning that Bev was not equipped to answer. I got home at 2 in the afternoon, and Maggie ran at me before I had my boots off. She said, "Did you fix it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Did it chime?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What does it sound like?" And I thought about that hallway, about the 9 warm tubes, about Constance sitting still with her hand on the oak. I said, "It sounds like a house remembering what it is." Maggie considered this with the seriousness she brings to things she's trying to decide whether to believe. Then she said, "Okay. Bev let me have orange juice and I feel fine, so I think that was unnecessary." I laughed. The first real one in a while. It came up from somewhere low. June called that evening. She said her mother had called her into the sitting room after I left, and they had talked, really talked. She said, the kind of talking they hadn't done in she wasn't sure how long. She said her mother had kept the letter on the table beside her chair all day. She said the clock had chimed every quarter hour, and each time it did, her mother went a little quieter, and June was starting to think that quiet was not always what it looked like. I said, "How long are you staying?" She said, "I don't know. Longer than I planned." There's a photograph on my workbench now. Maggie took it the day the clock came back together. I have a little travel clock I was servicing beside it, both open, movements visible, gears catching the light. She said it looked like 2 hearts. She's 9, and she says things like that, and I have learned to just write them down somewhere so I don't forget them. I've been back to the property twice since October. The clock is running perfectly. The moon phase window has turned a little every day, and the painted sky behind it has moved the way Frederick Hale must have watched it move, through however many seasons he had left after he restored this house and filled it with things he loved. Constance met me at the door the second time. No assessment in her eyes, just recognition, like I was someone who belonged in the doorway. June was there. She showed me a photo of a long weekend she and Constance had taken, somewhere on Vancouver Island. They were standing in front of a very old tree, both of them squinting into the same sun. I don't know what the future looks like. I'm not someone who's ever been good at that particular thing. But I know that a clock ran for a long time, stopped, and ran again. I know that a man I never met left a letter for a person he couldn't name, trusting that the right one would come. I know my daughter tells me every morning what she thinks, and every night what she dreamed, and I am, without question, the luckiest wreck of a man in Northern Ontario for it. There's something you might be carrying right now, a call you haven't made, A door you drove past and kept going. A letter you wrote and didn't send, or a letter you never wrote at all because you told yourself you had time. Frederick Hale thought he had time. He didn't. So he did the next best thing. He left a message in the last place he knew would stay closed until the right moment. If you have someone you haven't called, not because the moment isn't right, but because the moment never feels right. Because fear sounds a lot like patience when you let it. I want you to think about that clock. Standing still for 12 years. Still worth fixing. Still capable of running exactly the way it was made to. Some things don't stop because they're broken beyond repair. They stop because no one has been brave enough to open them up yet.